Okay, so I wanted to take us through a quick review of everything that may or may not be on today's midterm. So obviously this is going to cover PowerPoints 1 through 5. However, like the information in 5 is probably going to be pretty limited considering that's the actual assessment stuff. We really just wanted to touch on that before the midterm so that we have a little bit of more of a foundation as we are going into the second half of class. So primarily you're going to spend your time, if you are committing to some studying today, on PowerPoints 1 through 4. So um, first thing we're looking at in our first PowerPoint here, we got to talk about the kinetic chain, right? So our kinetic chain, more commonly known as like our human movement system, are all three of those systems that work together to produce human movement, right? So that's going to be your nervous system, which is responsible for like acts as sort of the communication network. It's gathering information and then choosing which response is most appropriate and then sending the information back out in response. You've got your muscular system, which is under the control of the nervous system. It's responsible for generating internal tension in order to actually move your body. So your nervous system sort of tells your muscular system how to respond, and then your muscular system does that, right? And then you've got your skeletal system, which is providing you a framework, allows your muscular system to have something to actually move, allows your muscles to have kind of a resting place, so gives you like an overall framework there. So if any of these systems are out of whack, it's going to affect the other systems, right? If your skeletal system is pulled into an awkward posture, you know, this is hard tissue that's not really going to be able to move, so it's going to affect how your muscular system is able to move, and then that's going to affect how your nervous system is receiving information. So all of it is very, very interconnected. So we're going to go through each of those individually right now. If you're looking at your nervous system, right, its main function that it's going to have is going to be sensory, integrative, and motor function, right? Sensory function is like sensing information, like as information comes in towards the brain. You've got integrative function, which is where your brain is sort of choosing what response is most appropriate. So if a muscle gets overstretched, the nervous system knows that that can lead to damage. So what it'll do is it'll send a signal to contract that muscle. And that last one is our motor function, right? That's the neuromuscular response to that sensory information. If you touch a really hot stove, right, sensory information's coming in and it's saying, hey, that's really hot. And then the integrative function is going, oh, well, really hot means that the hand is going to get damaged. And so then it'll choose to pull the hand away, and then it'll execute that with its motor function, and it'll actually contract the muscles to get you to move your hand away. So all of that is like your function, right? Now, another big part of your nervous system is our spatial awareness, right? Our proprioception. So proprioception is your body's understanding of where it is in space, right? It's its ability to sense the position of all of your body parts. So it's able to do that because you have specialized sensory receptors running throughout your entire body, right? So sensory receptors are basically specialized sensors that transform information into something the brain can interpret. So like you have photoreceptors in your eyes, for instance, and they respond to like different wavelengths of light. And so then that gets transformed into color, and then your brain understands it. You have got chemoreceptors, which respond to different chemicals, and that gives you, you know, taste and smell and things like that. Most of those aren't really relevant to us as trainers. The big ones we are going to talk about when it comes to sensory receptors are a category called mechanoreceptors. And mechanoreceptors are sensory receptors that respond to physical changes. So when something changes in the environment and they experience that, whether it's like touch or stretch or pressure or anything like that, they're going to send that information to the brain. So the big ones we're going to be looking at are muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs, and joint receptors. So your muscle spindles, those are the sensory receptors that are running throughout the length of your entire muscle. They tell your brain what length the muscle is at, right? So like what ends up happening is like if I contract my bicep like this, right, I can straighten my arm all the way down, I can pull my arm all the way up like this. If I leave it halfway in between, the muscle spindle is sending a signal to my brain saying, hey, the bicep is at 50% of its maximum length, right? And now my brain is going to interpret that information, and it knows that my elbow is in this position here. Now, those muscles can definitely get overactive. If your actin and myosin fibers get into a contracted state and they stay shortened like that, your muscle spindle starts to sort of learn that that is the new norm, right? And so then it becomes an overactive muscle spindle, and it'll tell the brain, hey, we can't stretch any further, but we know that's not necessarily true. Then we have our Golgi tendon organs. Those are sensory receptors that are not located throughout the belly of the muscle. These are going to be located in your tendons, right? So all of your muscles are always going to end by inserting onto a bone by using a tendon, right? So you get the muscle belly, and then it gets tighter and tighter, and eventually becomes like a tendon on both ends. And that's what grips your bones. Your Golgi tendon organs live in that tendon, right? And their job is to make sure that like your tension never gets high enough to pull that pull that muscle off of the bone, right? So those are your Golgi tendon organs. They're sensory receptors that sense tension and rate of tension changes. So you know, when you stretch let's say you have an overactive muscle spindle that as you're stretching it, it's sending a signal to the brain saying, hey, we're at max length, we can't possibly go any further. But the Golgi tendon organ realizes there's very little tension and it's not likely to rip off the bone. Well, then it can send a signal that will inhibit that muscle spindle. We call that process autogenic inhibition. And that's how we actually improve our mobility. Now you also have joint receptors. Joint receptors are going to be sensory receptors that are located in the structures of your joints. There's actually a few of them, but their job is to sense the pressure and acceleration or deceleration of your joints. So as you are moving, they're sending signals to the brain saying, hey, we're accelerating, or hey, we're decelerating. Or like if I lock my joints out, like, hey, there's a lot of pressure in here, right? And so that's, again, how my brain sort of interprets where it is in space. So all three of those things work together to give us proprioception, but you know, they can become overactive or underactive, and so that can alter our proprioception, and then we're going to move the wrong way in response to that altered proprioception because your brain's getting the wrong signal. You know, it's like trying to navigate using the wrong map. So then we got our skeletal system. This is going to be a series of bones and joints and connective tissue that, again, provide us with a framework for our muscles, and then they also act as the levers for our muscular system to be able to move things around. So if we're looking at our bones, right, they're going to be the actual levers that we manipulate, right? So they provide something for our muscular system to contract and actually manipulate. You've got your joints, which is the articulations where your bones are coming together. A bone might experience like one or many more joints, depending on the shape of that bone. And so we get two different main categories of joints here. We're going to see non-synovial joints, which are the primary types, and synovial joints. I'm sorry, non-synovial joints, which are the unprimary type, and synovial joints, which are like primarily what you're going to find throughout your body. So non-synovial joints are like joints that don't actually have any connective joint cavity, right? They don't have like a lot of space in between them. There's two main categories there. There's cartilaginous joints and fibrous joints. Fibrous joints barely move, like really are not designed to move at all. Like the sutures of your skull, you know, your skull is meant to kind of act as sort of one large bone. But cartilaginous joints, you know, they have a little bit of ability to move, but like not very much. They don't have a joint cavity, so there's very little space, which doesn't give them very much mobility. Your pelvis, parts of your pelvis are non-synovial cartilaginous joint. But the synovial joints, they make up 80% of the joints in your body. That's what you tend to think of when you think of joints. You know, it's like where your skeletal system's actually manipulating and moving around. So those are your synovial joints. They have synovial fluid in them. They have a cavity. They'll have some cartilage in there. But the primary thing that you're going to find there is that they are held together with ligaments, right? That's the main thing that's holding your synovial joints together. So in the same way that like tendons are attaching your muscles to your bones, ligaments are attaching your bones to your bones, right? So a tendon is like soft tissue connecting to hard tissue. Ligaments are attaching two hard tissues together. So that is sort of that in a nutshell. And lastly, if we look at the kinetic chain here, we've got our muscular system, right? Now your muscular system is under the control of your nervous system, right? Its job is to have a whole bunch of little cells that are able to contract and bundle all together to shorten the overall muscle, right? If you got 1,000 muscle cells that are all shortening at the same time, the entire muscle is going to reduce its length. So a muscle is basically just a bundle of what we call fascicles, right? And a fascicle is just a bundle of individual muscle cells. So you'd have a whole bunch of muscle cells all bundled together, and we would call that a fascicle. Then you would have a whole bunch of fascicles all bundled together, and we would call that a muscle, right? Again, all of those muscles are always going to end in what we call a tendon, right? So like all the fascicles eventually come together and create this really stiff fibrous tissue, and then that inserts onto the bone. So that is your tendon. Now, if we zoom in like crazy and we look at an individual like muscle cell, you're going to see this area inside of your muscle cells. One of the things that makes them very special is called a sarcomere, right? And the sarcomere is basically, we call it the functional unit of the muscular system, because it's what allows the muscular system to do its really cool function to be able to shorten and relax, right? So the sarcomere is sort of like the area of a muscle cell, right? It's not necessarily like a physical thing you can hold, it's just a section. So the sarcomere is basically made up of these little things called myofilaments. And myofilaments are these little proteins, these little specialized structures inside of your muscle fibers that are able to like contract and pull onto each other, right? So the first one you've got is going to be what's called actin. It's this little tiny thin strand, and there's a bunch of strands of actin, and they're kind of like laid out like this. And they're going to be attached by this thing called a Z line, right? So, you got an actin strand running, from here to here to here. Meanwhile, on the other side of the sarcomere, you've got another Z line, and you've got more actin strands running from there. So they're all kind of arranged like this. Now, in between each of those, you're going to have these really thick bands called myosin. Myosin's thick bands have these little heads that reach off of them. They're kind of shaped like this. And what they do is they reach up and grab the actin strand's binding sites, and then they pull it like that. They actually pull and shorten your overall sarcomere. So what's going to happen is, like, if you got myosin heads that are both pulling towards their center, kind of like this, right? They're reaching up and grabbing and pulling like this. The whole Z line is going to kind of shorten and get closer together, right? That is the shortening of your sarcomere. Now, we also have two other myofilaments in here, which are called troponin and tropomyosin. They're regulatory proteins that are going to block the actin's binding sites, right? So if myosin always wants to bind to actin, but we want to be able to relax our muscles, we need to have like a chaperone in the way to sort of block those binding sites when we want to be able to relax a muscle fiber, right? So luckily you've got those regulatory proteins. So in summary, right, you get your actin strand, which is thin, you get your myosin strand, which is thick. The myosin strand is going to reach up and grab the actin and pull it towards its center. That's happening on both sides of the Z lines, so the Z lines are slowly coming together and your muscle is shortening. As we look at our muscles, right, one of the things that we're talking about when we talk about labeling out our muscles, we got to understand like which muscle we're talking about in relation to which movement, right? Like if I talk about elbow flexion, I need to be able to describe what muscle is primarily responsible for elbow flexion. Now, if I talk about elbow extension, I need to talk about like which muscle is responsible for elbow extension. So we have this kind of term for this, which is going to be either agonist, antagonist, synergist, or stabilizer. Any muscle can be any one of these things. It just depends on like what motion it is you're referring to. So if I'm referring to like hip extension, I'm going to refer to my gluteus maximus as the agonist, right? So the agonist is the main muscle that is responsible for whatever action I'm talking about. In this case, I'm talking about hip extension as my action, therefore my gluteus maximus is going to be my agonist, right? But I got some muscles that are there to help in hip extension, and those muscles are going to be referred to as synergists, right? They're working together with my prime mover. They're not the main star of the show here, they're just there to help, right? And so synergist muscles like my hamstrings are going to assist weakly with like a little bit of hip extension, right? Again, the glute is the main star of the show here, but the hamstrings are going to assist. Meanwhile, I've got some muscles that are going to work in the exact opposite direction of my agonist. Those are called our antagonists, right? So if I'm talking about hip extension, my hip flexor complex is going to be an antagonist, right? Because it's in charge of the exact opposite motion. And they're going to pull in the exact opposite direction. Then I'm also going to have stabilizers, and stabilizers are there to kind of stabilize the whole system, right? While I'm doing hip extension or hip flexion, while I'm doing any of that movement, my core muscles are making sure that my spine isn't randomly moving in any random direction, and it's keeping my pelvis in the alignment that it needs to be in order to perform hip extension. So an agonist is the prime mover, an antagonist is opposite of the prime mover, a synergist is an assister muscle to the prime mover, and stabilizers are there to stabilize the entire body. Any muscle can be any of these things. It just depends on what motion it is you're talking about. Then if we talk about like our support systems, right? So we understand our kinetic chain. Now we got to kind of look at our support systems, like how we are going to be able to actually do all this movement stuff. Well, we need to be able to like produce enough energy in order to do that. So, and if we're going to produce energy, we need to be able to gather nutrients and move those nutrients around the body. And for that, we're going to have the cardiorespiratory system. So your cardiorespiratory system is made up of two, again, intertwined systems here, which is going to be your cardiovascular system. That is your heart, your blood, and your blood vessels, right? That's providing a means to transport everything. And your respiratory system, which is actually providing a means to extract oxygen from the environment. So let's look at the cardiovascular system first. This is, like I said, is going to be made up of your heart, blood, and blood vessels. Your heart is this really cool organ that is designed to maintain and generate pressure, right? Now, it's made up of all these little these four main chambers, 2 atriums and 2 ventricles, right? Ventricles pump blood out of the heart. Atriums gather blood once it's returned to the heart. Now, the right side of your heart, you know, if your heart's main job is to like pump blood throughout the body, and you know, blood's job is to carry all the nutrients that you gather from your respiratory system, we got to get blood over to the respiratory system to be able to pick up those nutrients. We got to pick up that oxygen, right? So the right side of your heart is going to pump that blood over to your lungs in order to gather that oxygen. Now, once it's got that oxygen, we got to get it out to the rest of the body. So it's got to travel back to the pump to get pumped everywhere that it needs to go. And that it means it's going to travel back into the left side of your heart. And then the left side of your heart is going to pump that out throughout the rest of your body, right? So that is sort of an overview of the chambers of the heart. Now, in the right atrium, there's this specialized little structure called your sinoatrial node. This is your SA node. And this node's job is to control the rhythm of your heart, right? We want our heart to be able to contract as much as possible because that generates maximum pressure. And generating pressure is the entire purpose of your heart, right? And we also want it to be able to relax in order to generate maximal pressure, right? So we don't want the fibers of our heart contracting randomly. We want all of the fibers to contract simultaneously. And that's why we have our SA node. It's going to set the pace of your heart. When your body starts to realize that it's not getting as much oxygen as it needs to get, you're going to quicken your breathing, but you also need to be able to like pump that blood out to the body, right? So your SA node is going to go, okay, well, we're going to increase the heart rate, and it's going to pump a little bit faster and therefore deliver oxygen more frequently. Now we do have a measure for how we can how we measure the performance of our heart. And we're going to call that the cardiac output, right? This is really the main reason we're even talking about the cardiovascular system right here, because in our assessments class, we're trying to measure someone's cardiac output. So your cardiac output is the performance of the heart, right? It's going to be made up of 2 concepts. It's going to be made up of your heart rate, the number of beats per minute, and your stroke volume, the amount of blood ejected per beat, right? Now, we can't really measure somebody's stroke volume, but we know that stroke volume and heart rate both work together to determine your cardiac output. So if your stroke volume kind of sucks, like if you have a weak heart that isn't pumping blood very effectively, your heart's going to have to beat more often to deliver the same amount of blood. So your heart rate is going to be relatively high. This is why a low resting heart rate is a good indicator of health, right? The lower your resting heart rate, typically it means that your heart is very effectively pumping a lot of blood with every beat, so it doesn't have to beat quite as often. And that's why we measure heart rates so frequently. So if we're looking at blood, again, blood's job is to like deliver oxygen throughout the body. It is made up of little red blood cells called erythrocytes. Those erythrocytes have this really cool little protein in there, which is called hemoglobin, which is basically like a little protein that your body makes that uses iron as sort of an ingredient that binds to oxygen. And so hemoglobin is sort of what grabs oxygen molecules, and that's how you're able to carry oxygen from your lungs down to your left foot, you know? Now, obviously, we got to be able to get it down to the left foot, so we have all these little blood vessels that allow blood to travel where it needs to go. You know, you can think of this as like the highway running throughout your body, where red blood cells are traveling down in order to deliver what they need to deliver. So your blood vessels are a closed circuit of tubes that allow blood to be transported to and from the heart, right? Because once we deliver it, we also need to get that blood cell back so we can deliver the next load later. So you've got arteries, capillaries, and veins. veins. Those are your main blood vessels, right? Your arteries are going to be blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart. Your veins are going to be blood vessels that carry blood towards the heart. And then all the area where arteries and veins sort of meet up are going to be what we call capillaries. They form these really big beds that kind of surround our whole tissues and allow for blood to sort of drop things off and pick things up and then travel in whatever direction they need to go. If your capillary needs to get back to the heart, well, then it's going to travel through a vein. If it needs to like get to the body's tissues, it'll travel from an artery, drop that off in the capillary bed, and then again, it's going to kind of finish off by getting picked up in the veins and travel back to the heart. So those are your blood vessels. Now, that's your cardiovascular system. Also, we need to look at our respiratory system, right? So that's going to be located, that's going to be made up of two main things, which is your respiratory pump and your respiratory passageways. Your respiratory pump is basically what gives you the framework to allow for ventilation, right? If you think of your lungs as these big empty sacs, you know, this is what's allowing you to kind of expand those sacs, which causes a rush of air to travel into our lungs. Now we've got a whole bunch of oxygen molecules inside our body, but we got to be able to get those into our actual blood, and that's where your respiratory passageways come in. And so basically these are a series of little tubes inside of those sacs that oxygen's actually going to travel down, and eventually they're going to be covered in blood vessels. And those blood vessels are where the exchange is actually happening, where you are picking up oxygen and dropping off CO2. Now, when we're looking at that, the way we consume oxygen, if we're kind of understanding our respiratory system, the resting oxygen consumption for a human being is going to be about 3.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of their body weight. So if you weighed 100 kilograms, you would be consuming 350 milliliters of oxygen per minute, right? Now that is when you are at rest. If you are not at rest, you are going to burn much more, right? Let's say you are consuming, let's say you weigh 100 kilograms and you're consuming 700 milliliters of oxygen per minute. That's twice as much oxygen as before. So we have a term for that 3.5 milliliters. We call that one metabolic equivalent, or a MET, right? And a MET is basically you know, you at rest. If you're consuming 2 METs per minute, that means that you're burning twice as many calories because you're consuming twice as much oxygen, right? So that's one of the ways that we measure oxygen consumption. Now, oxygen consumption is a really key term here because it determines how well your body is utilizing oxygen to produce energy. And so we have another term for like the maximal amount, right? If you're in really good shape, you're going to be able to consume lots of oxygen because your cells know how to like effectively work. But if you're in not so good shape, you're going to be struggling with how much oxygen you can consume. So we need to be able to measure, you know, how much oxygen a person can consume. And so we have a term for that called your VO2 max. It is the volume of O2, the volume of oxygen that you can consume at maximum, right? The higher your VO2 max, the better better cardiorespiratory shape you are in. And so obviously that becomes really relevant for this course because we are looking at being able to assess how well somebody can cardiorespiratorily function. I'm not sure that cardiorespiratorily is a word. Now, another thing we need to look at if we're talking about assessments is understanding like biomechanics, right? Biomechanics is how your body interacts with like the outside world, right? And so like if you have proper posture, you know, you are evenly distributing gravity against your skeletal system. But if you have altered posture, well, now your skeletal system is pulled into compromised positions, which means, you know, it's not going to be able to move very effectively. You're going to have altered biomechanics, right? So in order to understand biomechanics, we have to understand three main concepts here, which is going to be your anatomic locations, planes of motions, and your muscle actions, right? So your anatomic locations are basically just a way for us to be able to label the body and speak very clearly, because like if you said like the head is above, right, you know, the rest of the body, that would be true if somebody's standing upright. But if they are standing on their head, well, now their head's below. And so, you know, if you were just to say, you know, something is above something else, that would sort of leave you to determine, it's like, well, I guess they're maybe in a standing up position, but you don't know that for a fact. So we need to have like a term that is the body when it's at a resting position. So we have the anatomic location, the anatomic position, which is the body standing erect with toes pointing forward at hip width apart with palms facing forward and arms at your sides, right? So that's the anatomic position there. All of our anatomic locations are in reference to the anatomic position. So if I said something is superior to something else, it's because that's how it is when the body is at rest. If the body's laying down, it doesn't matter. It's still superior. So superior is going to be a position above a point of reference, right? So superior is above, inferior is a position below a point of reference. So inferior is below. Anterior is going to be a position on the front of the body. Posterior is going to be a position on the back of the body. Medial is going to be along the midline. Lateral is farther from the midline. You've got proximal, which is closer to a point of reference. If no point of reference is given, then it is the dead center of the body. So my wrist is distal because it is farther in comparison to my elbow, right? So my wrist is distal, whereas my elbow is proximal. But if I give a different point of reference, right, if I mention my shoulder, right, now my shoulder is proximal, but my elbow is distal, right? So those are in reference to other positions. Then you've got contralateral, which is a position on the opposite side of the body. My right hand is contralateral to my left hand, right? They are contrary to each other. And then ipsilateral is a position on the same side of the body. My right ear is on the same side as my right hand. So those are your anatomic locations in a nutshell. We've also got planes of motion, which sort of describe like the primary directions that our body moves in, right? So you got the frontal plane. That's going to divide my body into anterior and posterior portions. You always move along the plane of motion that you're describing. So if I talk about the frontal plane, I'm going to move along that plane by moving side to side, right? I'm being divided down the middle, so I need to slide in the direction that I'm being divided by. The sagittal plane, that's going to divide the body into left and right halves. I'm going to move along the sagittal plane, right? So that's going to be front to back motions instead of side to side motions. And then the transverse plane is going to cut me into upper and lower halves along this way. So if I'm rotating my arm like that or rotating my head, I'm sliding along that plane. That is a transverse motion. Then if we're talking about like how our muscles move, right? When a muscle is acting as an agonist, for instance, it is concentrically contracting. When it's acting as an antagonist, it is eccentrically contracting. So, we have different types of contractions. A lot of people think that contractions are only when a muscle is squeezing, but when a muscle is relaxing, that is a type of contraction as well. So eccentric contractions are when a muscle is lengthening, right? So if a muscle is acting as an antagonist, it's pulling in the opposite direction of the direction you are moving. So that is being lengthened out. That is an eccentric contraction. When your muscle is lengthening or when that muscle is generating less force than whatever direction you're moving along, right? So if I'm moving my palm down towards the floor, I am eccentrically lengthening my biceps. Now, isometric contractions are sort of in the middle. They're there when you are like holding a position. So if there's no change in muscle length and it's just kind of stabilizing and you're staying in one spot, that's an isometric contraction. You're probably using your abdominals isometrically right now to stabilize your body as you sit upright. Unless you're like, slouched in a chair right now. And then we got our concentric contractions, which is when a muscle is shortening, right? So if a muscle is overcoming a resistive force, right? If I've got 10 pounds in my hand, but I generate more force than that, I'm going to be able to overcome that 10 pounds because my muscle is shortening. That's going to be a concentric contraction. Whenever a muscle is acting as an agonist, it is concentrically contracting. So now we need to talk just really briefly about how we actually sort of learn all of these movements, right? How does your body learn proper biomechanics over time, right? Because when you first started walking, you were all off balance and you were probably falling a lot, but then eventually your body learned how to leverage the right muscles in order to keep you moving. We have a term for that. We call that your motor behavior. It's how your body learns and adapts to different types of movements slowly over time. The two big concepts here are going to be your motor control and your motor learning, right? So your motor control is how your nervous system integrates information with past experiences. So if it learned, 10 pounds of force is in your hand and you need to generate at least 11 pounds of force to overcome it, that's part of your motor control. Your brain's going to go, oh, I need to generate 11 pounds of force, which means that I need to recruit 1,824 muscle fibers, you know, like it knows exactly how much like it has to kind of recruit in order to get that done. That's because of your past experiences. Now, motor learning is how you develop those past experiences through practice, right? So like if you only do it one time, your brain's not really going to memorize that information, but motor learning is like, you know, relatively permanent changes that come through like practice, right? The more often you lift that 10 pounds over and over and over again, eventually your body gets really good at it. This is why I always tell people like walking is just as hard as it was the day you were born. It may not seem like it's all that difficult to you anymore, but that's only because you are really good at it. If anything, walking is harder. You weigh more as an adult than you did when you were a baby. You know, nothing ever really gets easier. Your body just gets really good at it. That's like that's your motivational quote for the day. Now, in order to understand like how motor behavior actually functions, right? If we're looking at, you know, motor control and motor learning, we need to understand like how our brain interprets the information coming from all of our muscles. And so again, we kind of come back to the concept of proprioception, right? Proprioception, your body's spatial awareness. It's all of the information from sensory neurons coming into your central nervous system, right? And all the information going out away as well, right? So proprioception, the cumulative neural input from all of those receptors is how your brain is interpreting that information. Without proprioception, we can't have motor behavior. Three main concepts that are related to our proprioception, you know, how we maintain it, how we can alter it, are things like length tension relationships, force couples, and sensory motor integration, right? So length tension relationships are the length at which your muscle can generate the most force. Unfortunately, if a length tension relationship, let's say you develop scar tissue in a muscle, so now that muscle is going to try to protect itself by kind of staying in this big shortened, contracted state. You know, that's going to lead to your actin myosin fibers on like a cellular level already being kind of crossing each other, right? So that's a shortened muscle. That's an overactive muscle. That's an altered length tension relationship. Now your muscle can't generate as much force as it's supposed to. So now when you try to like move, your body's not going to be able to move properly. And so, you know, your proprioception is going to pick up on that and it's going to try to move you in another way. This is what happens when you see somebody try to do like a shoulder press, but they might have like a tight rotator cuff. And so, you know, they can't actually hold their arms overhead like this, like they should be able to. So instead what they'll do is they'll arch their low back and lean back like this. Now they're working against gravity, but they're using their pectoral muscles to kind of leverage it, right? And that's all because they had an altered length tension relationship caused by maybe a tight rotator cuff. Now, force couples are another big part of this, right? I started using other muscles to kind of get the job done because, you know, I've got several muscles that are all supposed to work together, but if they're working together dysfunctionally, I have an altered force couple. So what a force couple is it's muscles working synergistically to produce movement. You know, when I do a shoulder press straight up overhead, my lats need to relax, my lower traps need to allow my scapula to stay in like a proper alignment. My deltoid muscles need to contract to overcome that weight. But if my rotator cuff muscle is like pulling me into internal rotation, as I try to lift my arm overhead, you notice I can't really do it, right? If I have my shoulder tilted forward like this, because the bones are grinding up on each other. So now my body's going to find another way to kind of get me to move. And it looks like I raised my arm straight up overhead, but in reality, I lifted it at this forward angle here, right? So I have an altered force couple due to an altered length tension relationship. Now my brain is learning how to produce the wrong motor response, right? Now my brain is learning how to do things in a way that it's not really supposed to. So all the sensory information coming in, my brain's figuring out how to get it done, but it's not really supposed to do that, right? And that's because of a process we call sensory motor integration, right? It's your nervous system's ability to intake sensory information in order to produce a response, right? So if your sensory motor integration is altered because your brain's taking in information and just finding another way to get the job done, you're going to have what we call relative flexibility. You're going to move like, yeah, you got the lift overhead, but you didn't do it the way the body is really designed to move. You have altered sensory motor integration, right? Your nervous system's ability to sense stuff is producing a motor response. You know, proper sensory motor integration is your brain learning how to move the way it's designed to move, right? So all that's really important to assessments, and that's sort of your foundational stuff that you're going to be tested on later today. We'll get this review video up, and you'll see the Canvas midterm is up there. If you guys have any questions, feel free to call or text me. Shoot me an email, do whatever you got to do. But good luck, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow for the second half of PFT 101.